All right, and although most of my research has been done in HIV prevention, I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm just going to talk about the vaginal microbiome. So I'm going to talk about modulating the vaginal microbiome to prevent urogenital infections using a new term, LBPs, and I'll tell you what that is. Raina, I want to thank you very much for setting up the playing field for the vaginal microbiome and how important the vaginal microbiome is for future life. The human microbiome is unique. A healthy vaginal microbiome is a low diversity microbiome. And we hear a lot about the gut microbiome and high diversity, and I think Raina showed you various examples of women that have low diversity and women that have high diversity, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Ideally, the vaginal microbiome is dominated by the genus Lactobacillus. I cannot see this. And I say the vaginal microbiome is unique because lactobacilli, while found in other animals and at other sites, no other animal species has a lactobacillus-dominated vaginal microbiome other than humans. And the 4 species that are most commonly found, although this is not exclusive, are Lactobacillus crispatus, Lactobacillus jansseni, Lactobacillus gasseri, and Lactobacillus eners, which again, Raina told you quite a bit about. 3 of these are hydrogen peroxide producers and produce D and L lactic acid. And eners is not a hydrogen peroxide producer and produces only L-lactate. Many of you have heard about the Ravel study, which looked at the vaginal microbiome of a number of women. And he found about 5 community states. 4 of these were dominated by lactobacillus, different lactobacillus, but Lactobacillus jansseni, gasseri, crispatus, and eners, while the 5th had a much higher proportion of anaerobic organisms and more diversity. And you can see below the diversity groups. The women with lactobacillus dominated have what's considered low diversity, and the women with polymicrobial have high diversity. Now, in a low diversity microbiome, you've got, again, lactobacillus dominated, and I said a picture is worth 1,000 words. So you have your gram stain, you see mostly lactobacillus, and if you look at this communities plot, and this is a number of women, each column representing 1 woman, most of her microbiome, most of each one of these women's microbiome is lactobacillus. And these women had mostly Lactobacillus crispatus. They have low Nugent scores and low vaginal pH below 4 to 4.5. When you get a dysbiosis of the vaginal microbiome, which again, I thank my colleague Raina for telling us more about this, you see a high diversity microbiome. And there's a decrease in the number of hydrogen peroxide producing lactobacilli, and again, an increase in diversity. And again, a picture worth 1,000 words. You can see the gram stain up above. You see really polymicrobial. You see Fusobacterium forums. You see cocci. You see rods. And it's represented, again, in these community plots, whereas the women on the right-hand side have high numbers of Adepobium, the BVAB organisms, Gardnerella, Smithia, and many others. And also the pH in the vaginal tract goes up. These women have high vaginal pHs above 5.5. So dysbiosis can lead to health consequences, and thank Raina for touching on these. Bacterial vaginosis, and interestingly, recurrent urinary tract infection. Women with dysbiotic vaginal microbiomes are more prone to UTIs. And obstetric complications, preterm birth, reduced success for in vitro fertilization. I'm going to now quote the paper that Raina quoted because it's actually one of her papers, but the vaginal microbiomes are modulators of the host immune response. So a lot of work discussed that women, you see a lot of women who have polymicrobial microbiomes. Is this normal? How can you not call these women normal? But I believe if you look at, you see in this study, which is South Africa, there were women with Lactobacillus crispatus, and there were women with a polymicrobial, what we would consider a dysbiosis. And you can see that those two groups cluster very differently. They don't even overlap when you look at a principal component plot. And when you look at the inflammation in those women, again, you've seen this slide, I simplified it. The women that had the immunity type 4 with a high diversity and high levels of Prevotella had increase in inflammatory biomarkers, IL-1 alpha, beta, TNF alpha, interferon gamma, IL-10, and IL-8. Conversely, the women who have Lactobacillus crispatus had the lowest level of inflammation. So to me, that says when you have Lactobacillus, you're in a non-inflammatory state. That's the ideal state. When you have a polymicrobial state or a dysbiosis, it may be normal for that woman, but it's not the ideal state. So how can we treat, how do we treat dysbiosis? The current CDC guidelines are to treat it with antibiotics. You use metronidazole for 7 days, metronidazole for 5 days, clindamycin. Their alternative treatments are more antibiotics, tinidazole, clindamycin. But what about a big alternative, which would be a live biotherapeutic? And I'll talk the rest of my time about Lactin-V, which is a product that we're developing. And I might say that I work for a company that's developing this Lactobacillus crispatus as a live biotherapeutic. But again, I also have a guest appointment at NIH to work on HIV prevention. So what is a live biotherapeutic versus a probiotic? An LBP is a biological product that contains live organisms such as bacteria and is applicable to prevention, treatment, or cure of a condition or disease of human beings. Now, if you listen to those four words, prevention, treatment, cure for a condition of human beings, it's exactly what a drug is. These are FDA guidelines. This is FDA response on what is a live biotherapeutic. And this is their term, not my term. What's a probiotic? Well, probiotics are well-known microbial products, but they're regulated as foods or sometimes supplements. They're not drugs. They can only make structure function claims, such as supports digestive health. What does that mean? Doesn't really mean much. It's not a health claim. When you make a health claim, you can say that you've tested this organism and it actually improves the health of the vagina. That's the distinction between a probiotic and a live biotherapeutic. The difficulty or problem with probiotics is there are many probiotics on shelves. Some of them contain live organisms. Some of them don't contain any organisms at all. Some of them contain dead organisms, and they're just not well regulated. So you don't really know what you're getting. So how can we use this concept to treat women? We have antibiotics and live biotherapeutics such as Lactin-V. So again, when you have a healthy vaginal microbiome on the far left, you see a very uniform microbiome. Then you take antibiotics, you deuce, you're ill, something precipitates a dysbiosis in that microbiome. You lose lactobacilli, and you get this more diverse microbiome. You're treated with antibiotics. So in some cases, women will revert back to the good, healthy state. But in many cases, about 30% of the time or more, depending on the population, you go back to dysbiosis because there was nothing good to replace those organisms. You knock them down, but they come right back. So now, if you treat with antibiotic and then add back in a Lactobacillus crispatus, which is one of the best lactobacilli, you have a better chance to actually restore that microbiome. So Lactin V, which is the product that we're developing, is a Lactobacillus crispatus that's being developed under FDA guidelines under an IND, so like an investigational new drug, but it's a biologic. It has health claims, and it's not technically a probiotic. The Lactin V is a single strain of Lactobacillus crispatus. It's a safe and effective colonizer of women. It targets the underlying cause of the recurrent infection, which is the dysbiosis of the microbiome. We have made it as a high-potency formulation that's temperature stable. What is the population that might receive this? 1 in 3 women have a lifetime risk of developing a dysbiosis of their microbiomes. We take a lot of antibiotics these days, and that can result in loss of those good lactobacilli that live in the vagina. So risk factors are sex, a new partner, douching, antibiotic use, and about 22 million women in the US, but again, the same proportion or more in other countries. Many of these women are not symptomatic, so they may have a dysbiosis, but they're not aware of it. And again, standard treatment is an antibiotic, and there's about 30% recurrence. So Lactin V has been through a phase 1 clinical trial. It was safe and well tolerated, and that work is published in 2009. Lactin V has been through a phase 2A. There was colonization in about 75% of the women that were treated for bacterial vaginosis, and colonization correlated with a reduced BV recurrence. And that work was published in 2010, and we're now an ongoing phase 2B at 4 sites: Chicago, San Francisco, San Diego, and Atlanta. And this is a doubly blind, placebo-controlled, randomized clinical trial of women with bacterial vaginosis. I just wanted to show you a snapshot of a woman who was treated in our phase 2B study, and you can see the microbiome changes during a successful colonization with Lactin V. On the far left, when this woman was screened, you can see she has Gardnerella at high levels, Megasphaera, Adepobium, Snethia, VBAB, and she has Lactobacillus iners, but not the good Lactobacillus crispatus. Those levels are very low. Then she's treated with antibiotics, and you see the levels of those bacteria drop. But you don't really see Lactobacillus crispatus come back until Lactin V was administered, and then Lactobacillus crispatus comes up high. Now, in some cases, the woman's own lactobacillus will also start to come back. So all it takes is kind of resetting the system by adding in lactobacillus. And you, again, see that the Gardnerella drops precipitously and stays down with treatment, and this was at 28 days. So that's the resolution of her dysbiosis. So vaginal microbiome modulation, my conclusions and outlook are that we're developing an LBP, Lactin V, as a commensal human vaginal. It's a commensal human vaginal lactobacillus. It is a high-potency, stable drug product. It's delivered as a freeze-dried powder. The strain colonizes a majority of women, and it reduced the incidence of recurrent urogenital infections. We also have it's being used for treatment of recurrent urinary tract infections, and in those women, we actually saw a statistically significant 50% reduction in recurrent UTIs. So in the near future, combinations of antibiotics and LBPs as microbiome modulators may be an integral part of the standard of care. And I'd like to thank you.